give you a warm welcome to the first edition of the CPR Dialogue. And we are exploring the theme, Navigating India's 21st Century Transitions. To give a brief overview of the event and the next 2 days, I'd like to invite our President and Chief Executive, Center for Policy Research, Ms. Yamini Iyer, to please address the gathering.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for braving the traffic and being here bang on time. I'm sorry, we thought we'd give it about 5 or 7 minutes, but we don't want to penalize all of those who've made the effort to be here on time, so we'll begin. I thought before we launch into the first panel of the day, I'd just spend a few minutes giving you a brief introduction to this dialogue. Even a quick look at the headlines today gives a sense of many grave challenges that India is facing, from the agrarian distress to the question of jobs to the economy bumping up and down. The present day of policy making is without doubt filled with many difficult challenges that policymakers face. But underlying these everyday challenges are a larger set of issues that often get hidden when we focus exclusively on the headlines of today. The big transitions that India is currently undergoing, and the manner in which we negotiate these transitions is, we feel at CPR, going to fundamentally shape our development trajectory over the next few decades. There are questions of India's growing economy and increasing energy demands, while at the same time ensuring that India stays green. There's the big concern of agrarian distress, but the fact of the matter is that India isn't rapidly transforming into a non-farm economy at the pace and scale as much of India would like. And that itself is significantly impacting the nature of our polity and the nature of our politics. There is this big looming question of our cities. Anyone that has made their way here today has made their way through the smog, and the question of air pollution hits our headlines every day. But even as India is going through this urban transition and urban chaos in our metropolitans, a lot is happening in small towns, and a lot is happening, in fact, in rural areas that are today transitioning into urban. We don't even have an understanding of what's going on there, and we definitely don't know what kind of governance structures we need to build in order to ensure that that transition to urbanization doesn't fall into the chaos that Delhi, Mumbai, and Calcutta face today. So it's to deal with these transitions that we thought we'd initiate a conversation that steps away from the present and takes a long view. But as we take that long view, come back to the present and ask ourselves a question of what are the right kinds of policy pathways and institutional mechanisms we need to seek to be able to appropriately manage this very complicated transition. And it's in this spirit that we've organized the discussions over the course of the next 2 days. We start this morning with the pressing questions of climate change and where do we go from Paris and beyond, followed by a discussion on air pollution. In the afternoon, we are very excited to launch a new set of work that CPR is going to be engaged in over the next decade, the role of technology, which frankly intersects with everything that we are discussing over the next 2 days, but also raises very critical technology-specific questions in terms of how we can leverage the technology ecosystem, but at the same time ensure that we build a legal and regulatory regime that is ethical and inclusive. So we'll have a set of conversations around these questions, and going forward, I think you'll see a lot more work on this at CPR. And we'll close the day with an opening panel that will have the very difficult task of bringing together these different, sometimes disparate, but yet completely interconnected issues to do a little bit of crystal ball glazing and ask ourselves where India is headed over the next few decades, and what is it that policies can do to ensure that we negotiate our challenges smoothly and effectively for a sustainable and inclusive future. Tomorrow will be spent dealing more specifically with questions of energy and urbanization. And all of this is taking place in the context of a very complicated, very disruptive, and quite frankly confusing global environment. So we'll spend the latter half of the day tomorrow talking about geopolitics, the changing world order, the emerging world order, whichever adjective you use, it's just chaotic. So we're trying to we hope tomorrow afternoon to make some sense of that, and particularly ask the question of what India's role should be as the world goes through its disruptions and as we go through our own development transitions. And with that, we'll close these 2 days. So I hope to see many of you through the course of the next 2 days. Thank you so much for being here, and especially to our panelists, many of whom have flown from different parts of the world to be here with us for these next 2 days. Many of our panelists who've taken time out of their busy schedules to be here, even from Delhi, and navigate our transport, our traffic to get here on time. But most of all, I'd like to thank my colleagues at CPR, without whom this would not have been possible. All of them were excited and happy to indulge me in this idea. It's new for CPR to move out of our building and be in a different place to have these conversations. But everyone has been very public spirited about it and participated with great excitement. So thank you all for making this happen. And especially to our communications team that has worked day and night to make us look slick and put different parts of CPR together into a cohesive narrative. And I can tell you, it's not always easy. So none of this would have been possible without the energy and creativity and vision that they brought to this event. So a special thanks to them, and with that, look forward to an exciting 2 days. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yamini, for that insightful and promising address. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few housekeeping announcements. One, lunch will be served by the poolside right next to the Viceroy Hall, which is where we're at right now. Tea and coffee will be served here all day, so feel free to get tea and coffee when you need. We will be live tweeting this event. The CPR Twitter handle is @CPR_India and hashtag CPR Dialogues. So if you're on Twitter, please tweet and let the world be known what's happening in these rooms the next 2 days. We recently launched the CPR Youth Awards, and there's a small corner on my left where you can see videos of entrants who've participated in the awards. So during the next 2 days, make your way there and see the videos as and when. And finally, please remember, we're running against a very, very tight schedule. Request you all to please adhere to time. And also, please keep your cell phones on silent. And now, to begin, our first panel is on climate change, the international climate change regime, looking back to look forward. The panel will be chaired by Ambassador Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, former ambassador and Indian climate negotiator. Welcome, sir. The panelists include Lavanya Rajamani, Professor, Center for Policy Research, Joanna Depledge, editor of Climate Policy Journal and senior fellow at Center for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance at the University of Cambridge, and Chandra Bhushan, Deputy Director General, Center for Science and Environment. Welcome to the panel, and we look forward to speaking to you. And I will be indicating time markers from back there, just to indicate how much time we have left. Sorry, but over to you, sir.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first session of the CPR Dialogue. This deals with the international climate change regime. We meet in the wake of the Katowice COP, which has adopted a rule book of sorts for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. This is an appropriate moment to take stock of where we stand in our response to climate change, to look back in order to look forward. Looking back at the evolution of the climate change regime, we find a paradox. In 1991, early in the negotiations leading up to the Framework Convention, Japan presented a proposal for a pledge and review agreement. This was immediately dismissed by other delegations as a totally inadequate response to the massive challenge posed by climate change. Most delegations insisted that we needed an agreement incorporating mandatory time-bound emission limitation commitments for all developed countries. And the 1992 Framework Convention provided a framework for precisely such action. And building on this foundation, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 set specific quantitative time-bound emission reduction or limitation targets for each developed country. Yet, even before the Kyoto Protocol had entered into force, developed countries began to demand a radically new agreement that would require many, if not most, developing countries to also accept quantifiable emission limitation commitments. And over the next few years, the Kyoto Protocol was effectively abandoned. The final outcome was the Paris Agreement, which requires all parties to submit nationally determined contributions to respond to climate change. So we are back to what is essentially a pledge and review agreement, an approach that was summarily rejected as grossly inadequate in 1991 is now hailed as a major breakthrough in the climate change negotiations. How does one explain this turnaround, this paradox? Does the explanation lie in some inherent but initially unsuspected deficiency in the design of the Kyoto Protocol, a deep flaw that came to light soon after its entry into force? Or did the change arise from economic and political factors extraneous to the climate change regime, such as the transformation of the global balance of economic power and political influence associated with the rise of China, followed by other populous countries such as India, Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa? It seems to me that new competitiveness concerns were a major driving factor in the decision of OECD countries to abandon the Kyoto Protocol. These concerns were initially reflected in calls from industry and trade unions for levying some sort of a charge on imports of carbon-intensive manufacturers from developing countries in order to offset emission limitation costs of domestic industries. Japanese businessmen referred to the CDM as the China Development Mechanism and questioned why they should pay to increase industrial efficiency levels of their major trading rival. Whatever the reasons for abandoning the Kyoto Protocol, we need now to make a realistic assessment of the potential of the Paris Agreement. The crucial question, of course, concerns the extent to which different states may realistically be expected to raise what the Paris Agreement calls their ambition levels. What conclusions can we reasonably draw from current trends and internal debates in leading countries? Given the magnitude of the climate change challenge, we may be excused for robust optimism, but it would be a disaster if we became climate change Micawbers. We have a truly stellar panel to address these and other relevant questions. Each of the panelists has a great international reputation, and they really need no introduction. And they bring to bear on climate change different perspectives. Dr. Joanna de Pledge is a leading international authority on the international relations dimension of climate change. She's also one of the very few analysts who have explored the organizational dimensions of the negotiations and the way in which the organization of negotiations helps to shape the outcome. Dr. Lavanya Rajamani is a leading international authority on the climate change legal regime. I hope one day she will also contribute, she will also favor us with a captivating account of the sometimes occult interactions between the chair and the secretary. And Dr. Chandrabhushan combines in himself the roles of environmental analyst, and advocate in his capacity as Deputy Director General of the CSE, an institution which made a seminal contribution to propagating a developing country perspective right at the initial stages of the climate negotiations. I now invite Dr. Depledge to make a presentation.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Ambassador Dasgupta, for your kind introduction. And I'd also like to say thank you so much to CPR for inviting me to come and speak to you today. This is my first visit to India, and it's a real honour for me to be contributing to this important discussion. So thank you very much. Now, I've been following the climate change negotiations for nearly 23 years now. My first climate conference was, in fact, COP2 in 1996 in Geneva, which might account for some of my white hairs. And perhaps because of this long-standing involvement, I too like to take a long view on the climate change regime, a historically informed perspective. And I'm very much in agreement with the theme of this discussion, the importance of looking back in order to look forwards. Now, as many of you may be aware, this month actually marks the 30th anniversary since the UN General Assembly adopted its first formal resolution on climate change. And it was also in 1988 that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was established and met for the first time. And you have here an image from that very first plenary meeting. And what I would like to do in the time allocated to me is to discuss some of these big picture developments that have unfolded over the past 3 decades. I won't go into much detail about what happened in Poland. I really want to focus on the big picture, the wide trends. Right. So firstly, I'm going to spend a few minutes actually recalling some of the achievements of the international climate change regime. I think often these achievements tend to get slightly overlooked in our despair at how slowly the negotiations are progressing. I then want to look a little bit about how our understanding of the climate change challenge has evolved over the decades, before finally looking forwards at the challenges that we face. So let me turn to these achievements, which I think we should celebrate. So from the first UN resolution in 1988, the international response to climate change has evolved into a very rich, elaborate, and largely well-functioning regime. So the 3 treaties, the Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement, they all enjoy almost universal membership. And I've listed here some key achievements that we should remember. So certainly keeping climate change high on the international and domestic agendas, promoting learning on important issues such as adaptation and forestry. We've come a long way in our understanding of these issues. And also boosting funding for developing countries. I know climate finance is still inadequate, but it's certainly at much higher levels than it would be without the regime. And I think an important achievement that's often neglected is actually the development of rigorous and consistent methodologies for estimating and reporting emissions data. So 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, maybe even 10, few countries really had any idea about their levels and sources of emissions, or indeed their sinks. And thanks to rules under the climate regime, with a lot of input from the IPCC, all countries are now equipped with much greater knowledge about their emission profiles. And as we all know, being able to actually measure a problem is always a prerequisite for doing something about it. Now, most importantly, the climate regime has prompted real change in national policy, real national policy change. So my colleague Navros Dubash is in the audience. He is part of a research team that has documented the spread of national climate change legislation and strategies over time. So this is a figure taken from their most recent publication in my journal, Climate Policy. And the countries in darker blue are the ones that have national legislation or strategies in place to address climate change. So you see how this has spread from 2007, the first map of the world, to 2017 now. And obviously this is all very much due to the climate change regime prompted that evolution of national legislation. So there are other achievements that I could highlight here. Maybe we can talk about them more in the panel presentation. I did want to make the point, though, that is often forgotten, that the emission targets in the Climate Convention and in the Kyoto Protocol have actually all been met. I think there's this kind of assumption that countries have not met their targets, that no progress has been made at all. But in fact, even in the Kyoto Protocol, all the parties that have remained parties to the Kyoto Protocol are actually all in compliance with their emission targets. We can talk about how ambitious those targets were, but on their own, according to their own criteria, the climate treaties do enjoy full compliance. I think it's worth making that point. So let me now turn to the second part of my talk, which is to discuss how our understanding of climate change has evolved over time. And I'll pick up on 3 points here. I could do many more, but I'll focus on the 3. Firstly, sharpening of the global goal, the way in which the climate change storyline has shifted from burden sharing more towards opportunity, and also the widening of engagement of climate action beyond governments. So let's take a look at the global goal. Now, the international community has clearly made great strides over the past 30 years in defining and refining the overall goal of the international community in relation to climate change. So the Convention famously established the ultimate objective of preventing dangerous human interference with the climate system, which obviously was quite a vague and unquantified goal. But then with the Paris Agreement, we've come a very long way in sharpening that. Now the international community has agreed to limit emissions at well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts towards 1.5. So these temperature goals were in fact already mentioned previously in the 2009 Copenhagen Accord and the 2010 Cancun agreements, but these were COP decisions with much less legal import. Now in the Paris Agreement, the temperature goals have been enshrined in a legal treaty, which is significant, and also accompanied by emissions objectives, so peaking global emissions as soon as possible, and net zero emissions by the second half of the century. And just recently, the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 has added greater precision as to what this means in terms of when we should achieve net zero in order to limit emissions to 1.5. Now, there is some debate about how useful these temperature targets actually are in legal terms, in technical terms, scientific terms. My personal view is they are actually very useful. I find them very significant as focal points for action in terms of trying to communicate what the climate change regime is trying to do to the media, to stakeholders, to ordinary citizens. Having these numerical goals can be very, very helpful in that respect, and I'll illustrate that a little bit more later. So another way in which our understanding of the challenge has evolved is in this gradual shift away from understanding climate change in terms of burden sharing, something quite negative, to a framing more around opportunity, something potentially positive. And we can certainly see an evolution over the years in the language used by policymakers, negotiators, business leaders that increasingly emphasises the benefits to be reaped by low carbon transition over the costs. Now, a key dimension here clearly relates to the dramatic advances over the past 30 years in terms of green technologies, especially renewable energy generation. So here, technological advances and favourable policies have certainly gone hand in hand to lead to precipitous declines in costs. And this has enabled wind and solar energy to become genuinely attractive alternatives in very many parts of the world. And these offer real economically viable possibilities to roll out energy access to poorer communities, especially in rural areas, and achieve greater energy independence. And in that respect, very much moving away from the realm of burden sharing into opportunity. And another very important dimension here is that of co-benefits, because very often taking steps to curb greenhouse gas emissions will lead to a whole host of other gains in terms especially of health and energy access. And obviously the classic examples in shifting from fossil fuels to cleaner renewable sources for electricity can dramatically cut local air pollution. We all know this. And often these co-benefits can be harnessed to improve the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable, so that tackling climate change becomes part of the development process, not in conflict with it. And that's very important because so often action to tackle climate change isn't really done for climate change reasons at all. It's done for some completely different policy goals. This integration of climate change and other social goals is very important. And it's actually very well reflected at the international level in the integration of climate change into the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which in fact were adopted just a few months before the Paris Agreement. So the IPCC's special report on 1.5 has a whole section on links between cutting emissions and the SDGs. And here you can't really see the detail on this slide, but this is taken from the Summary for Policymakers of the 1.5 report. And basically it tries to illustrate synergies and also potential conflicts between the SDGs and tackling climate change. And the blue bars are the potential positive co-benefits, and the brown ones are potential conflicts. And we can see that the blue significantly outweighs the brown. So co-benefits significantly outweigh potential conflicts between climate change and other SDGs. So that's obviously good news. Now, there are lots of other developments I could mention, but I'm sure I've got a time poster that's going to come up in a minute. So I will highlight one more. And this is the widening of engagements beyond governments. Now, I think it's certainly true to say that 30 years ago, 20 years ago, action in the climate change regime was very much government-led. This was very much a kind of top-down model, international treaty commitments negotiated by governments, who might or might not then involve business, industry, and other stakeholders in their implementation. Now, I mustn't exaggerate this because I was looking back, in fact, at the 1988 UN General Assembly resolution on climate change, and that very first resolution actually recognised the importance of NGOs and stakeholders. So I mustn't exaggerate this development, but I think it's certainly true to say that for many years, NGOs were kept at arm's length in the negotiations. They could only provide input through very carefully controlled channels. And all this has completely changed now. Participation in the climate change process has engaged a much wider range of NGOs now, and they're active at every single stage of the process, from the analysis, from providing expert input, pushing governments towards stronger action, all the way through to implementation on the ground. And obviously now we see that in some parts of the world where governments are reluctant to act, I'm sure you'll know who I'm thinking of, climate change action by non-state actors has been really crucial in plugging the action gap. Here I've included a logo, well actually the map that you see in the top there of the United States. That's a map from the We Are Still In coalition, and it includes over 3,000 regional city leaders who have pledged to uphold the Paris Agreement's 2-degree goal, despite the planned withdrawal from the Paris Agreement by the US administration. Also, America's pledge does something similar. And in fact, this illustrates the importance of having that 2-degree goal, because it's really something around which these coalitions in the US can unite in saying we're still going to meet that numerical goal. And there's a whole variety of coalitions outside the US of businesses, regional and city leaders who've come together to encourage strong climate action. And yeah, I could have filled this entire slide with more logos. There's C40 Cities, a very interesting one, a coalition of the world's megacities who've pledged to think about how their city can contribute their fair share towards the 1.5 goal. And again, we see these temperature goals coming up in the narrative of these coalitions. And obviously co-benefits, again, is a very important motivation for these megacities in terms of getting involved in climate change. Now, in terms of this wider engagement, I'm also detecting a trend towards a greater emphasis on the role of individuals, what individuals can do in their own daily lives. And certainly where I come from, in the UK, in Europe, people leading affluent lifestyles are becoming increasingly aware of their personal contribution to global warming and how changes they could make in their daily lives, in their routines, could lower their carbon footprints. Things like eating less meat, avoiding single-use plastic. That's a very big thing in the UK at the moment. Making different transportation choices, using public transport. These are increasingly becoming social norms in the kind of circles in which I move. And this is very much something new, I would say, in the past, maybe since Paris, in the past 3 years, that's evolved. And also in Europe and the US, elsewhere too, we're seeing the rise of demonstrations and largely peaceful social protest by ordinary citizens who are demanding more aggressive climate policy from their governments. And I think that's very important because ultimately the support of individuals is absolutely critical to the low carbon transition, because democratic governments simply cannot or will not take strong measures, especially strong fiscal measures, to tackle climate change if they don't feel they have the support of their publics. And we've seen in France, for example, I'm not sure if you've been following that, in India, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protest movement against the rising of diesel taxes in France. That just goes to show how, if you don't have the support of your public, it really is very, very difficult to implement low carbon fiscal measures. Maybe we can talk about that more in the panel. So I would argue that these are big picture developments, a more precise global goal, understanding climate change as an opportunity, climate action moving beyond governments, really put us in a much better position to effectively tackle the problem going forwards. But obviously, you know, I'm not pretending everything is fine. Clearly the game is not yet won, far from it. And despite all the progress I mentioned right at the beginning, global emissions still continue to rise. The latest data, preliminary data for 2018, suggests maybe a 2% rise in that year. So we still haven't reached peak global emissions. And there are 3 key challenges going forwards that I would like to argue, among many challenges, 3 key challenges I think we need to address going forwards. So firstly, although investment in new renewable capacity now vastly exceeds that directed to new fossil fuels, too much investment is still going to high carbon infrastructure. And in this respect, the third goal of the Paris Agreement, 2.1c, is sometimes overlooked with all the attention given to the temperature goals, but it's absolutely critical. The need to make finance flows consistent with a low carbon climate resilient world. So what is needed is to gradually but decisively withdraw support from the fossil fuel industry and redirect all that investment towards low carbon technologies. So in the UK and elsewhere in the OECD, we're seeing the rise of an increasingly strong divestment movement, which is calling upon large investors, so pension funds, university endowments, to withdraw their investments from fossil fuels. And these are having some limited success, although I can report not at Cambridge University, where our university endowment, which is one of the biggest in the entire country, has resolutely refused to really enter into any meaningful discussion on this. But ultimately, what we need to do is flip the financial market so that low carbon options receive the bulk of investment. Now, secondly, if I can go back, yeah, we need to start analysing better carbon dioxide removal and negative emission technologies. And I'm sorry to hear myself say this, because I've always been someone that's thought, no, we can't really talk about this because it might create a perverse incentive to take the foot off mitigation. Yeah, but I think we've reached the stage now where we need to start a conversation on the legal implications, the institutional, the governance implications of carbon dioxide removal and negative emissions. And why is this? It's because the IPCC has made very clear that any pathways compatible with 1.5 do involve widespread deployment, certainly of afforestation, and also of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So virtually any scenario taking us to net zero does involve these technologies, and I think we really need to start a conversation on their implications. If only because of conflict, conflict with potential land use, that there's real issues here surrounding even food security. And finally, the most difficult challenge, I'm sure Ambassador Dasgupta will agree with me, is continued political dysfunction within the climate change regime, and not just along traditional north-south lines. And underlying that, the persistent tendency for countries to still view the negotiations in terms of confrontation and competition rather than as a global endeavour. And unfortunately, we can't turn to the US for leadership, if we ever could. And the EU is seriously distracted at the moment with Brexit, Germany, all these things. And then anyway, perhaps the era of a single global leader is in any case over. And I think we're certainly seeing the rise of a much more polycentric world with power, influence, potential leadership much more evenly dispersed among the world's nations, and that's a good thing. And here I do see some positive developments in the emergence of various clubs, what we call clubs or coalitions of the willing, with ambitious governments, sometimes together with stakeholders, coming together to move faster on specific issues. And again, I have some logos to show you here. I'm thinking, for example, of the International Solar Alliance, with its genesis here in India, announced by Prime Minister Modi in Paris in 2015, to try and boost the deployment of solar power. I'm also thinking of the PPCA, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, an initiative of Canada and the UK, whose member countries are seeking to phase out unabated coal. Also, Mission Innovation, those countries are seeking to double public investments in clean energy and renewables. So maybe this is the new face of global political leadership, coalitions of the willing on specific questions. So in conclusion, I put it to you that there is reason for optimism. And looking back, the past 30 years have seen the evolution of this reasonably well-functioning and mature international climate change regime, which does enjoy the overwhelming support of the international community. We now have a much deeper and richer and more positive understanding of the climate change challenge, which does provide a solid foundation for progress. But obviously, many, many challenges still face us as we look forward to the future. And I'm personally very much looking forward to discussing with others in the room on how we can start to overcome these barriers that we face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deflens, for that excellent and very stimulating presentation. May I now invite Mr. Chandrabhushan to make his presentation?
Oh, yeah. Good morning, Ambassador Dasgupta, Lavanya, Johan. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, before I speak on the topic, let me first congratulate CPR for completing 45 years. There are very few institutions in this country who last so long, and institutions are important. I grew up with a person, Anil Agarwal, who believed very strongly in institutions. And I remember distinctly, before he died, we had a meeting at Center for Science and Environment. And I asked him how he would like to be remembered. And he said, through the institution that I have created. So, Yamini, congratulations to every one of you for completing 45 years. I hope you have much bigger celebration when you reach 50 years. So let's give a big hand to CPR, first of all. I think they have completed a very very important milestone. Now, having said that, when Lavanya got in touch with me, saying I need to speak, give a presentation, I said, I'm not going to give you a presentation. I'm just coming from Katowice, and I'll speak. And the topic was interesting. It fired brain waves, because the topic is to look back, to look forward. And what I'm going to do is to answer 5 questions. I'll not answer, but let's discuss 5 questions. Question number 1, is Paris Agreement the logical outcome of 3 decades of negotiations? Was it inevitable? I think it's something that we need to discuss. Question number 2, is Paris Agreement sufficient for the next 30 years? Was it inevitable, or is it sufficient for the next 30 years? Question number 3, if it is not sufficient, and if some of you have read me, you know that I am going to argue that it is not sufficient. I think most of us will argue it is not sufficient. Then what next for the global collective action to fight climate change? What do we do? Question number 4, and much more important for us in India, what role has India played in global climate change negotiations? We need to look back and analyze our contributions. And have we got what we wanted? It's something that I'll also like to discuss. And lastly, what next for India? What do we do? Do we follow business as usual? Do we follow business unusual? Is the last question that I would like to address. Let's start with the first one. I was on Friday, Saturday night I left from Katowice, and it was really disappointing. I don't want to use the word disgrace, but disappointing on the issues on which countries were fighting. They were fighting on how developed countries will report on money. They were fighting on whether there should be double counting on carbon markets or not. And they were fighting on what information countries would like to share with each other. So this is rock bottom as far as climate change negotiations is concerned. You are not fighting to increase ambition. You are not fighting how to get everyone together and make sure that we achieve something. You are fighting whether we should share information or not. Now, this is not collaboration. And if we say that this is the logical outcome of 30 years of negotiations, then there was something fundamentally wrong in 1992. Okay. And I look back to 1992, just think about it. 1987, we signed Montreal Protocol. And UNFCCC actually takes the architecture of Montreal Protocol, a much smaller technical protocol, to a much wider economy-wide negotiations. 1989, we ratify Montreal Protocol. 1991, Russia collapses, USSR collapses, US is the sole superpower, and we signed Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay. I think the sequence of events is important. America was a much more confident country in 1992. I don't think it was that confident in 1997, or by the time we reached 2008, 2009, and beyond that. Okay. So, as I look back, what becomes quite clear is that from a top-down framework of UNFCCC to the bottom-up framework and so-called nationally determined was actually by design. You know, in national legislation, we say first voluntary, then mandatory. Here we started with mandatory to reach voluntary. Okay. You first build confidence in the market. You first build confidence in parties before you decide for a hard target. And I'll agree with you, Ambassador Dasgupta, maybe it would have been important for us to start with a voluntary agreement to come to a mandatory, much harder, which is required now. You know, I will argue that we required much harder top-down global cooperation than what we needed in 1992. Think about it. In 1992, the CO2 concentration was 280 ppm. Today it is 405. the global emission was less than 25 gigaton, it is more than 50 gigaton. In 1992, and this is the most interesting statistics, more than 1 billion people didn't have access to electricity. Exactly more than 1 billion people don't have access to electricity even today. Okay. So if I would like to see the 30 years as not even quarter of glass full, leave half glass full. Okay. So I don't think it was inevitable because of a structural problem. You know, as an individual, we all are taught that we all need to take responsibility for our actions. Okay. This is as much valid for individuals, as it is valid for countries. Unfortunately, we have a Paris Agreement that actually condones inaction. Okay. That is the fundamental issue right now. And the motto is, everything is fine as long as you report. This is the motto of Paris Agreement. Okay. You do whatever you want, just report. It's a bureaucrat's delight. Nothing to offend bureaucrats, but it's a bureaucrat's delight. You know, it's all about collecting information, synthesizing information, organizing meeting, making reports of the meeting, but not coming out with a clear prescription. And this is, I'm talking about one top-down hook that Paris Agreement had, which was global stocktake. Now, the global stocktake today is doing all these things, but not prescribing what the world as a whole has to do, because it has to be non-policy prescriptive. I don't know from where negotiators get these words. Okay. So the outcome is going to be non-policy prescriptive, leave about telling what countries have to do. Okay. And, you know, this is what, I don't think this is an outcome that we need today in the country, today in the world. The other point I want to make here is, you know, I have just jotted down point, maybe sometime this week I'll sit down and convert it into a cohesive argument, coherent argument. The Paris Agreement also actually strengthened an obsolete model in which the world works, which is the Westphalian model of sovereignty. Okay, it actually strengthens it. It's an obsolete model. Okay. But this is what Paris Agreement does, that it is the right of nations to do whatever they want within their boundary. This is what Paris Agreement does. Okay. But the fundamental problem is, in an integrated world where environmental damage is transboundary in nature, this model doesn't work. Okay. It doesn't work with transboundary river problem, water sharing problem, and it doesn't work with climate change at all. Countries will have to subsume part of sovereignty in global democracy to solve global problems. That's not what Paris Agreement does. So the answer to the first question was it inevitable? Maybe it was, because the architecture started as a very hard architecture which countries were not ready to accept. And ultimately we have ended with an architecture which is not sufficient for combating climate change. Will Paris Agreement survive for the next 30 years? I hope not, frankly. Okay. It is not sufficient to solve, I have already said, it is not sufficient to solve the challenge that we face. And the fundamental reason is, you know, Johanna said that burden sharing is a negative term. I don't think it's a negative term. That's what successful societies are all about. We share burden. Okay, that's how societies are made. Okay, the strong supports the weak. I was told in school to support the weakest student. Okay, and confront the bully. That's what we all are. That's what makes a successful society. So I don't think we need to gloss over things that in which we have failed. We need to confront it and say, it is important to share burden. It is important to take care of each other. That is as important for a small community as it is important for a global community. So, as I see, Paris Agreement doesn't do that. okay? And therefore, I don't think we need this agreement for the next 30 years. I'm not saying that, this agreement, there should be a demise of this agreement. Maybe it should remain, but it should become more and more less important going ahead. Question number 3, if it is not sufficient, then what should we do? I think it would be foolish for us to do anything with UNFCCC. Okay, I'm making a very, very hard statement here, but I think it would be foolish for us to renegotiate another Paris Plus agreement. And why do I say that? I say that because it will not simply work. UNFCCC is an all-encompassing, everything in the world we are negotiating. It is impossible to negotiate everything with the same group of people. The task is just too vast. So the scale is unmanageable. We are taught in management scale. Understanding what scale you can manage is important. I think UNFCCC scale is just too vast to manage. And if you look at successful international treaty, scale has been important. And I believe Montreal is a very important, successful treaty because the scale is small. It can be managed. So the first reason why UNFCCC will not work, because the scale is unmanageable. Point number 2, it will not work because we have legacy of a toxic negotiation. Okay, I call it as toxic because of the kind of history and the baggage this entire platform carries, of fight between developed and developing countries, of promise not unfulfilled, of blaming each other. So I don't think it's a platform. We need to build on a platform which has such a negative foundation. Okay. So I think it has run its course. We need new platforms. Okay. We need new platforms which are manageable in size, okay, which are sectoral in nature, which are regional in scale. I think those kind of platforms are going to work. And we have to think about it. And then we need a platform which is going to be government plus platform. We should understand the limitations of government, till what level governments will deliver. So I see for the next 30 years, it is inevitable for the world to actually think about regional, sectoral, government plus platforms to address climate change. We have some experience in the past that we can build on, but this is what I see the future. Coming back to India, what role has India played in climate change negotiations? Frankly, as I was thinking, I never understood what India wanted, frankly, from climate change negotiations, other than the words that negotiators always, sorry, Ambassador Das Gupta, but I have never understood what the country wanted, except that it kept saying equity. And Anil would have been, he must be turning in his grave. Seriously, because the equity was something which he pushed. But if you look at his writing of 1992, it's very interesting. He said equity is important, but to keep the global emissions within the limit. What happened after that is that the principle became the end. Equity became the end, not a means to achieve an end. And therefore, it was fine for China to increase its emissions from less than 2 tons per capita to 10 tons today and still call it equitable. I think it was perverse of what Anil Agarwal had written in 1992. For him, environmental integrity was as important as equity. So an equitable deal with environmental integrity was what he was talking about. But somehow in the negotiations, that environmental integrity of the deal was thrown out of the window, and equity became all important. Okay. And for the past 10 years, I remember very clearly from 2008 onwards, CSE has been very uncomfortable with this whole idea of equity being now written on stone and not being challenged. And for the past 2 years, at least I have started writing that if you believe in equity, then operationalize equity for environmental integrity. I don't think India did that. So, as I said, I don't understand what the country wanted. other than the words that were spoken at the negotiations that we need equity and CBDRRC, common but differentiated responsibility and historical responsibility. So I'm not very sure what we wanted and what we have got. I do remember that one negotiator told me, I said, can you define what is equitable? And he said, I don't know what is equitable, but I do know what is inequitable. I said, what is inequitable? And he said that no one should tell us what to do. Okay, this is what this is what I was told. But anyway, I also think that post-Paris, in fact, post-Copenhagen, the grouping in which India placed itself was not appropriate. Basic, for example. I don't think there is anything common between us and the other basic countries. Brazil, South Africa, China. In fact, we boxed ourselves in a corner by grouping ourselves with basic. And then with LMDC, I've never seen a more unlike-minded country in a like-minded group. Okay, this is what LMDC is. From Saudi Arabia to Bolivia to China to India to Philippines, there's nothing like-minded in these countries. Other than the fact that they all hate the US. That's maybe the most common, baseline for all of them to come together. But, so I think, I'm not sure what we contributed, I'm not sure what we wanted and we got it. If we wanted carbon space, that's what, let me just say, if we wanted carbon space for our growth, then we should have asked for operationalizing of equity, which we never did. Okay. I don't think India was ever looking for money. We knew that we are not going to get money. So I'm not sure of what we contributed, something that maybe historians need to, and lawyers working in UNFCCC need to sit together and analyze. Coming back to the last point, and I think it is the most important point, what next for India? And I see this from a threat and opportunity perspective, from a frame of threat and opportunity. I do see huge energy security threat for India. And I do see huge climate impact threat to India. We are importing oil, gas, hundreds of millions of tons of coal, and that is a great national security issue for us. We need to start reducing our dependence on imported fossil fuel. Our coal mines are going deeper, our coal quality is reducing. So even if Coal India Limited will say that we have 60 billion tons of coal reserve, frankly, those reserves will not be usable. And we therefore have to think about, from energy security perspective, a new energy paradigm. I think this government is mindful of this. Our new energy policy in some way reflects that, but it needs to be reflected in practice. I also say this because, as was pointed out earlier, the energy prices are crashing from renewable sources. Okay? And just because we have coal doesn't mean we have to use coal. Just because there was guano doesn't mean we should keep using guano and not move to urea. That's the same comparison. So energy security threat and the climate change threat, the cost is going to be high. I'm just going to read out something which Kerala government brought out in a circular of the cost Kerala suffered because of one flood. So just bear with me. The estimate of losses suffered by Kerala is, and the compensation paid. Infrastructure loss, 20,000 crore. Material loss to household and businesses, 10,000 crore. These are the two cost figures that they came out with. Compensation to be paid, rupees 10,000 to 6 lakh families for buying essential items. Interest-free loan of rupees 1 lakh to each household to buy household appliances, potentially available to 7 lakh households. 4 lakh wells to be cleaned, compensation to be paid for crop loss and livestock. Total loss, 40,000 crore, not including losses due to loss in business and working hours. For a month, everyone was involved in rebuilding lives. Put together, we are talking about 50,000 crore rupees loss by one flood to one state. The whole budget outlay of Kerala is 35,000 crore rupees. One flood, 50,000 crore rupees in one state. Even if India suffers $100 billion loss each year, it is 3.5% of our GDP. current GDP. Okay. If US suffers $100 billion, it's 0.5% of its GDP. Doesn't matter to the US. But $100 billion matters to us. It wipes out half of our GDP growth. Yeah. Okay. So, as I see, it is important for us to recognize that these losses are going to grow. They are going to impact our growth and poverty alleviation program. It is in our interest to make sure that we contribute ourselves as well as push everyone to reduce emissions. Let me end by saying that there are four fundamental things if we are looking at a global cooperative model. A global cooperative model requires trust, empathy, cooperation, and right rules and practices. Unfortunately, all these four components is missing from Paris Agreement. We need to bring all these things again in international cooperation if we want to solve climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chandrabhushan, for bringing out in stark terms some of the limitations of the climate change regime and the need for sectoral, regional platforms involving both government and non-state actors. Finally, we have Dr. Lavanya Rajamani.
Thank you, Ambassador Dasgupta, and thank you to the other panelists for some fascinating talks. I must admit, when I was listening to Chandrabhushan, I was strongly tempted to throw out my presentation and spend 15 minutes engaging in a point-by-point rebuttal, especially the first half of his remarks on the international climate change regime. I'm going to resist that temptation for now, although clearly once the panel discussion starts, there'll be no holds barred. What I would like to do, though, is to redeem the process in your eyes, perhaps, in some respects, and picking up on some of sort of Joanna's remarks on the international climate change regime. So what I'm proposing to do in the next 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, is to talk very briefly about the Katowice rules. The Katowice conference ended late on Saturday night, so I spent most of yesterday reading 150 pages and trying to deconstruct the text of this agreement, but I'm only going to spend a few minutes on that because I think the most important or the more important moment that Katowice represents is what I'd like to focus on. It's a shifting of gears after this conference and after perhaps nearly 30 years of negotiations. So I will focus for the bulk of my 15 minutes on what we need to do beyond Katowice. And in this context, I'd like to talk about some of the Paris Agreement's strengths and how we might build on that, and addressing some of the Paris Agreement's weaknesses, which Chandrabhushan in particular has highlighted in stark detail. In particular, adequacy review and ratchet, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Okay, the Katowice rules. The Katowice rules try to instill some discipline in the international climate change regime, in the Paris Agreement regime that is focused on nationally determined contributions. How does it try to do that? For instance, although states have complete autonomy on the nationally determined contributions that they put forward in the process, and Chandrabhushan was absolutely right on that, there is complete autonomy that states have tailored to their national circumstances. They choose the nationally determined contributions that they put on the table with no international negotiation of these contributions. The rules do require some discipline in terms of the kinds of information that is provided with this. So while in the run-up to Paris, parties put forward their nationally determined contributions, they presented a range of information to accompany these contributions, many of which was incomplete, inadequate, insufficient. What the Katowice rules try to do is to instill some discipline in this, so they list out information that needs to be provided with the nationally determined contributions that parties put forward. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. The Katowice rules also try to seek to flesh out obligations in the Paris Agreement. There are numerous obligations in the Paris Agreement that in and of themselves will not be meaningful until they're actually fleshed out. and the Katowice rules do that. So for instance, something that's of particular interest to India, provisions to report, for developed countries to report on their provision and mobilization of financial resources. The Katowice rules actually list out 15 specific items of information that need to be provided in order to sort of fulfill that obligation of reporting on provision and mobilization of financial resources. So an important sort of intervention to make those obligations meaningful. The Katowice rules also operationalize a whole host of processes that the Paris Agreement established, like the transparency framework, global stocktake, and the compliance regime. The compliance regime in particular is of importance. And these processes have been operationalized. This is the oversight system in the Paris Agreement, and these have been operationalized now, and I'll talk about some of these, in particular the global stocktake, in a minute. Some issues were left for subsequent resolution, so this is not the end of the road as far as technical negotiations are concerned. The rules on markets in particular could not be agreed, and the rules relating to common timeframes. So right now, the nationally determined contributions of parties are set to different timeframes, 5 years or 10 years. After 2030, the expectation is, and the agreement is, that these nationally determined contributions will be set to common timeframes. This makes aggregation and comparison much easier, but parties could not agree on common timeframes right now, so this has been kicked down the road. So there will be some technical negotiations, but the bulk of the rules have been agreed. Bulk of the rules have been agreed to get the Paris Agreement off the ground. So at this moment, there is a shifting of gears, because we've had 30 years of negotiations that Joe spoke to us about. But as a result of those 30 years of negotiations, we have key instruments in place. We have obligations, different types of obligations in the Paris Agreement, binding procedural obligations or obligations of conduct. We have institutions, processes, and most of the rules in place. Like I said, a few rules remain for subsequent negotiation, but these are technical rules. The bulk of the rules have been agreed. So the focus now, as we shift gears, is very much on implementation, and this is when the hard work actually starts. Implementation of the agreement and implementation of nationally determined contributions. Now, this is clearly also a phase in which there will be less popular and political attention. Even the Katowice COP, if you saw the reportage coming out of it, it was at a very high level. It wasn't actually able to do justice to much of the technical negotiations that are ongoing and were ongoing in the last 2 weeks. The less political and popular attention, though, may not be a bad thing. I think the more high profile these negotiations are, the more likely it is that it will attract the ire of Twitter-happy heads of states, and we don't really want that, because it creates chaos in a process can actually be quite meaningful without that. However, it could also have negative implications in that there's less resources devoted to both the implementation of the agreement and to implementation of the nationally determined contributions. Now, that would be a mistake, a profound mistake, because at this point in time, we need sustained engagement from states, non-state actors, and a whole host of actors to deliver on the promise of the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement, no doubt, and both Joe and Chandrabhushan referred to political dysfunction. The Paris Agreement is birthed of political dysfunction, and as a result, it has some strengths, but also significant weaknesses. Some would say that some of its strength actually lies in its weakness, because one of the strengths of the Paris Agreement is that it has near universal coverage. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which, attractive though those prescriptive targets might be and legally binding obligations of result might be, the Paris Agreement does not contain that, but the Paris Agreement actually has nationally determined contributions covering 99% of emissions, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which covers 24% of global emissions in the first commitment period and only 12% of global emissions in the second commitment period. So strengths and weaknesses, some of its weaknesses in some respects are its strength, because without those weaknesses, we would not have universal coverage of global greenhouse gas emissions. So what we need to do now is to build on the strengths of the Paris Agreement and actually address its weaknesses. And in addressing its weaknesses, we need to keep in mind that this entire process is a result of political will or lack thereof. It's a consensus-based process, and there are deep vested interests in it. And it functions in the context of a very changing, dramatically changing geopolitical scenario. So what we did get from the Katowice conference to some extent, and in 30 years of negotiations, is as Chandrabhushan put it, is inevitable perhaps, but it's not all bad. I would not be so dismissive of many of the achievements as he was. So how do we build on the Paris Agreement's strengths? One of the core strengths of the Paris Agreement is the information flow that it sets up. As I said, Chandrabhushan was quite dismissive of the fact that all it's doing is, it's a bureaucratic sort of wonderland, perhaps. It's just information that we're dealing with. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. The Paris Agreement requires ex-ante reporting. So there's reporting as parties put forward their national determined contributions. They have to report on a whole host of items in relation to those nationally determined contributions that they put forward. And the Katowice rules flesh these out. The significance of this is that it ensures contributions that parties put forward are clear, transparent, they're understandable, they can be aggregated and compared. This was not the case before. There's also now mandatory provision of information. In the past, parties were allowed, in the first sort of set of nationally determined contributions, parties were allowed to choose. They had utter discretion on what information they would provide and whether they would provide it at all. So the language that was used, for instance, in 1 CP21, that's the COP decision that accompanied the Paris Agreement, was may include as appropriate inter alia a whole host of information. The language we find now in the Katowice rules is that parties shall provide a whole host of pieces of information. And this information is significant because, as I said, makes the contributions clear, transparent, and understandable. So there's ex-ante reporting before contributions are put on the table. There's ex-post reporting when parties are actually implementing their national determined contributions. So one of the elements, for instance, from a very extensive set of rules on transparency coming out of Katowice is that states are actually required to identify indicators and provide information on how they're progressing in implementing and achieving their contributions. This is particularly significant because the Paris Agreement does not contain an obligation of result. It does not tell parties you have a national determined contribution, and if you do not comply with the nationally determined contribution or achieve it, there are legal consequences. It does not do that. It does not do that because of the political dysfunction that we've been talking about. But what it does do, the Paris Agreement, is to say, well, even if we don't hold you accountable if you do not achieve your targets, we nevertheless require you to demonstrate that you are making your best effort to achieve those targets that you've identified for yourself. And the ex-post reporting framework, specifically requiring parties to identify indicators and demonstrate how they're progressing in relation to those indicators, is a very significant achievement. So what these try to do is to instill discipline and accountability in national implementation processes. To complete the loop, so there's ex-ante reporting, there's ex-post reporting, and then every 5 years there's a global stock take to see if collectively we are progressing towards the long-term goals of the agreement, which includes the long-term temperature goal. And this global stock take contains information or allows information to seep into the process from state, non-state, and intergovernmental processes. If you look at the global stocktake decision emerging from Katowice, it's a whole host of sources that have been identified. And yes, it's information, but I would not be dismissive of this information. If we did not have information, for instance, emerging from the 1.5-degree report, we would not have seen CSE's position on many of this change so dramatically as well. So I think information is quite significant in these respects. So there's a whole host of information coming into the global stocktake, including from non-party stakeholders, which means also, as an aside, that information also from non-parties, like the US, will be in 2020, can feed into the global stocktake. And it covers all areas: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, which was an issue in Katowice, support, and equity. and equity, which of course I actually agree with Chandrabhushan on India's position on equity, which has been a bit schizophrenic over the years. But equity in the global stocktake is a cross-cutting issue. It occurs in several paragraphs in the global stocktake decision. It is not equity in relation to quantitative indicators of equity, and it's not equity in relation to historical responsibilities, which India had asked for, but there is equity, and there are numerous sort of instances of equity being actually considered in the global stocktake. Now, the significance of this is that states are required to provide information on how outcomes of stocktakes have been taken into account in framing their next contributions. It's certainly true that the global stocktake does not result in policy prescriptive advice to individual governments, and that again, is a result of the political dysfunction that birthed the Paris Agreement. But states are required to demonstrate how outcomes of stocktake have been taken into account in framing their contributions. So the loop is sort of complete in terms of information flow. So the information flow loop, the ex-ante reporting, the ex-post reporting, and stocktake demands that states actually generate and present robust information on their contributions, on their actions. And it also demands that states build capacity, institutional research, and technical to be able to produce this information. And this will help develop better and more tailored regulation, evidence-based governance and implementation processes, and lead to more ambitious targets. And there is a leap of faith there, and I have to acknowledge that. It's very much a leap of faith that this will eventually lead to more ambitious targets. But the information flow in the system and the effects that generation of that information has on states will result in better policy. And that is a very key outcome, I think, of the international process right now. The Paris Agreement, no doubt, has very significant weaknesses. And of course, Chandrabhushan highlighted these. It does not have an adequacy review. So this is not a weakness in the Katowice rulebook, it's a weakness in the Paris Agreement. It does not have a review of adequacy of individual parties' contributions. Parties have complete autonomy in the contributions that they put forward. There is no international negotiation of that. And as a result, there is also no ratchet. So if you're not actually reviewing the adequacy of individual countries' contributions, there is also not a ratchet, in a sense, to increase those contributions if they're found to be inadequate. So the Katowice rulebook does say, for instance, the outputs of the global stocktake should have no individual party focus and should only include non-policy prescriptive consideration of collective progress. So Chandrabhushan is absolutely right on that. And there is also limited leverage that there is in relation to implementation. However, the Paris Agreement can be bolstered in this respect from outside the regime. Because as I said, the Paris Agreement is birthed of political dysfunction and is a product of the political will or lack thereof that we currently have. So wishing it away is not going to wish away the lack of political will. What we do find is that it has some core strengths, and those core strengths I've just spoken about, and the weaknesses can be addressed from outside the regime. The weaknesses can be addressed through adequacy review in national courts. So for instance, we have the Urgenda climate case, which is a good example, against the Dutch government that required the Dutch government to increase its targets, found them to be inadequate, required the government to increase its targets. It's recently been confirmed by the Dutch High Court in 2018. There's a very interesting case before the European Court of Justice where 10 families, including Sami reindeer herders and French lavender farmers, have filed a case against the EU, claiming that their targets are inadequate and they need to increase them in line with the goal of well below 2 degrees centigrade and aspiring to 1.5 degrees centigrade. There's adequacy review from youth activism. There are cases in the US, the Juliana case, so a group of youngsters that have filed a case claiming that the actions of the US government actually impacting their rights to life and liberty, and also impacts and it also impacts the public trust nature of the resources that the government is dealing with. There's a Swedish 15-year-old who's cutting class, apparently, to fight the climate crisis. She's sitting outside the parliament and addressed the Katowice conference as well, requiring the Swedish parliament to increase its targets. So there's a role for individuals as well, and Joe sort of raised this, and you see even 15-year-olds have a role in this adequacy review outside the regime. There's also implementation beyond states, and Joe again referred to this. This is the NASCA portal, the Non-State Actor Climate Action Portal, which was launched at the same time as the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, even at the time, parties knew that it would not be a one-stop shop, that there will be actions outside the agreement that would bolster and complement the agreement. And the latest count is 12,396 stakeholders representing nearly 20,000 actions across the world. There's another example of that is the one that Joe also raised. The We Are Still In campaign is just one example amongst many where this group of leaders from the US, sub-state and non-state actors, including university presidents, have committed to meeting the US target on NDC, even though the US government has announced its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. And implementation through courts as well. This is an interesting case in the Lahore High Court, Asghar Legari, where the litigant claimed that Pakistan had a climate change policy which was not being implemented. So they challenged the Pakistani government, and the court set up a commission to monitor implementation of the climate change policy that Pakistan had adopted. So in conclusion, the next phase of international climate change governance is critical. It is not going to be a phase that's going to grab the headlines as much, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. This phase requires significant ratcheting up of capacity and of dedicated resources to generate robust information and tailor policy and action to it, and to implement mitigation and adaptation actions. And this is also a phase that requires sustained engagement from states, sub-state actors, courts, non-state actors, both in enhancing nationally determined contributions and in implementing nationally determined contributions. I'd like to leave it there, but I'm sure in panel discussion there will be interesting questions to be addressed. Thank you.